I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
We'll look at what the phrase moderate rebels really means. Plus,
more moderate rebels are now coming together to fight back.
Who are the truly moderate rebels, and they're not very good fighters, apparently.
Killing all of the moderate rebels or semi-moderate rebels.
Moderate rebels. Boy, can you help me out with that term? What the hell is a moderate rebel?
Yeah, well, and our...
Moderate
rebels.
Welcome to Moderate Rebels. I'm Max Blumenthal with Ben Norton, and that was our NPR-inspired jazz soundtrack.
A bit crazier than NPR.
Yeah, sort of NPR on bath salts or something.
Or bath salt in Arabic.
Yeah, bath. That joke was inevitable. And this is the first episode of our podcast, which needed to be done because there aren't enough podcasts, but actually, I think it does need to be done. We've been doing a lot of writing at the Gray Zone Project at Alternet, which is alternet.org/Gray Zone Project, covering the permanent war state and empire and kind of connecting the dots to how it affects our politics back home. And I think there are other journalists who've been doing what we've been doing for a long time, but I do think that we are filling a void, especially in progressive media and especially in the Trump era, when progressive media and mainstream media sort of seem to be kind of in line in a way I've never seen before, in a very disturbing way.
Absolutely. I mean, as Max said, there's, of course, a bipartisan consensus, and this has been really underscored in the so-called Democratic resistance, where the only time ostensibly progressive Democrats applaud Trump is when he's bombing the Middle East. We saw this with Syria. We see it even with Yemen and other countries. We see it with his increasing aggression against Iran and, of course, North Korea and Venezuela. Trump campaigned sometimes flirting with this anti-interventionist rhetoric. And in some countries like Syria, he has actually taken a step back a bit in terms of escalation of the war. But then in other places, Trump is escalating the conflict. And what we're seeing is Democratic leaders and the putative progressive resistance are actively pushing back against his attempts to de-escalate the very few conflicts he's trying to de-escalate, namely Syria. So we think it's really important in this incredibly dangerous time to provide a critical dissident perspective that looks at what the U.S. empire is doing around the world and that calls it out for what it is, an empire. Foreign policy is really frequently a euphemism for U.S. imperialism. The U.S. has the largest empire ever constructed in history, with 800 foreign military bases, 96% of the world's foreign military bases, and more than 15,000 military personnel in more than 150 countries. This is an enormous empire, and with this podcast, we're really going to try to call it out for what it is, and to really highlight a lot of these issues that are largely ignored by mainstream corporate media. We know there are already 1,000,001 podcasts out there, but we hope that we're filling an important void politically and also, of course, journalistically. Moderate Rebels is normally going to be a weekly podcast, but for our first release, we have 3 related episodes we'll be releasing a few days apart. The first episode is about Russiagate and how Democrats are using it to distract from domestic problems, by which the Democratic Party can completely reject any kind of progressive left-wing reform and double down on its hawkishness. This effectively inoculates the Democratic Party and its Wall Street-backed establishment against any kind of self-criticism for losing a presidential election to the least popular candidate in history, a far-right billionaire bigot. The second episode is about the CIA program arming and training rebels in Syria, in which the U.S. and its allies spent billions of dollars essentially strengthening and fueling Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other extremist groups in the country. And the third episode is an interview with the investigative journalist Gareth Porter, who has done extensive reporting on the CIA program in Syria and just what the U.S. and its proxies were doing there. We are, of course, on social media. We're on Twitter at Moderate Radio. And we also have a website, ModerateRebelsRussiagateDelusion.com, where we have show notes from every single episode where we'll include links to the articles we discuss and other things for those who want to do more research. So enough with the intro. Here's the show.
Our show is called Moderate Rebels, and since it was ironically titled that, we thought we'd dedicate the first broadcast to the cutoff of aid and arms to the supposed moderate rebels, and kind of explain how those arms wound up just kind of inadvertently falling into the hands of Al-Qaeda's Syrian franchise and spawning the largest franchise of Al-Qaeda since Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan prior to 9/11. You know, and Ben, you raised an interesting point, which is that the idiot liberals, or what I like to call the idlibs, they do really celebrate Trump whenever he expands empire, whenever he launches cruise missiles at a country that isn't sufficiently compliant with American foreign policy demands, which we saw in Syria.
Alexander Coburn used to call them cruise missile liberals.
Yeah, the cruise missile liberals, but we're going to call them the idlibs. And, you know, this week, the idlibs, not only did they get upset, I mean, you saw everyone from Nicholas Kristof to Max Boot, who's more of a neocon, or just, you know, this chicken hawk warmonger, freak out about the cutoff of the CIA program to arm Syrian rebels. You know, it was a very pro-Al-Qaeda freak out. But then you also saw a sort of a celebration of extremely harsh and aggressive sanctions on Russia, which triggered an escalation, diplomatic escalation by Russia, sanctions basically ejecting 755 American diplomatic officials or employees from, you know, consular installations in Russia. We're just kind of heading into the abyss here. And this was all the result, in my opinion, of kind of domestic political hysteria. It really feels like we're walking on a knife's edge right now. Russia is the only country in the world that has the capacity to reach us with nuclear weapons and incinerate us. I don't think they have any intention of doing that, but it should, you know, it's something to consider, something to be cautious about. And it does appear that we are entering into a new Cold War that has been driven largely by the partisan hysteria that erupted after the surprise election of Donald Trump.
And of course, NATO and the U.S. Have been increasing aggression against Russia for some time. NATO currently has thousands of troops on Russia's borders, but this is a unique development. I mean, every administration, regardless of party, takes a very antagonistic stance toward Russia, but the Democratic Party is intentionally inflaming relations between the countries for domestic political gain, risking a viciously violent war or proxy conflicts that lead to countless deaths in order to score points domestically when they should be hitting Trump where his real problems are, his extreme bigotry, his blatantly anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant xenophobia, his ridiculous, almost comical corruption, the fact that we have a billionaire president whose administration is filled to the brim with former Goldman Sachs apparatchiks, or the fact that he's fulfilling a lifelong Republican dream of dismantling the Environmental Protection Agency, giving corporations free rein to destroy the planet for profit. But instead of hitting Trump where it matters and dealing with these critical internal issues, the Democratic Party leadership is focusing laser-like on Russia, accusing anyone who doesn't toe the line of being a Kremlin shill and ultimately risking a violent conflict with another nuclear-armed superpower.
And there are obviously interests, some of which are connected to the Democratic Party, some of which sort of reflect the bipartisan consensus around empire, which you could describe as the permanent war state behind that are stimulating the Democratic opposition with leaks and there are so many interests behind this, but obviously one of the main ones, or at least the face of Russia hysteria, is the Democratic Party establishment. So I went on Tucker Carlson to make pretty much the same points you just made, which is that the Democratic establishment is, using Russia scandal mongering and making these accusations of collusion and driving us, into a new Cold War for political convenience, because it's an easy way of attacking Trump without having to do anything progressive or put forward a genuinely progressive agenda that would center around something like single payer healthcare, which is really controversial within the Democratic Party when so many Democrats are taking money from the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry.
Even though a majority of Americans, regardless of political affiliation, including many Republicans, support single payer.
Right. Well, it's extremely popular, and you look at what happened in California, but let's not get sidetracked. I went on Tucker Carlson because he had been taking the fight to the neocons. I definitely don't agree with his politics on immigration, and on a host of other issues. But I'm not going to sit in a corner and talk to myself. And that's pretty much what I would have been relegated to doing if I had tried to get on Chris Hayes or Rachel Maddow or, Jake Tapper, who's is basically a State Department marionette who spends his entire show pushing regime change on either Venezuela, North Korea, or Syria every day. So I got a chance to say what I thought about Russiagate, or what you could call Russia hate, and the way that the Democrats are exploiting it and the long-term damage it will do to this country and to the world. And I think I made my point pretty well. I made it well enough to get Peter Beinart to respond to me. And for years, Peter Beinart, sort of the liberal Democratic pundit and really the gatekeeper of liberal Zionism. He sort of almost supplanted Jeffrey Goldberg in that role. He had never acknowledged my work on Israel-Palestine. He would never directly address the work of the Palestinian journalist and public intellectual Ali Abunimah. He just would never address anyone to his left. And it was mainly because we were never granted a kind of national platform. And Tucker sort of started bringing people in who had been denied a voice in mainstream media. And so Beinart obviously was irritated by this. He was especially irritated by the fact that I called into question the attribution of the DNC hacks to the Russian government, to Russia's FSB and GRU, the military intelligence agency. And he wrote a column in The Atlantic attacking me and Glenn Greenwald as Trump's left-wing defenders. I don't know if he came up with that headline, but it didn't match the content. It was an idiotic headline.
Which is also surprisingly similar to a piece last year by Jamie Kirchick, a neocon warmonger that he published in the Daily Beast, libeling a dozen left-wing writers and intellectuals, including a former Princeton professor, Stephen Cohen, as supposed Trump supporters. And this is a part of a longer trend.
I can never really read Kirchick. It's so feverish and boring. It's like these 20,000 word screeds that could have been written from like solitary confinement inside the American Enterprise Institute. And like responding to it just feels about as pointless as responding to the little like mouse that crawls out from under my stove every night. And I kind of like stomp my foot on the floor and the mouse runs away. So, but Beinart, I think, it's worth kind of responding to and addressing his arguments. And, it's also just funny to me that he finally decided to acknowledge someone to his left. And I think it's because they're losing control of the debate. The resistance bunker is really getting much, much smaller and a little bit more hysterical these days.
In this part, Max and I are going to go through point by point and show how a lot of the Russiagate talking points spewed by the Democratic Party, many media flunkies and others, really don't stand up to critical scrutiny.
First of all, Beinart challenged my point that the Democratic establishment is focusing around the supposed Russia scandal so that they can avoid actually doing anything progressive or putting forward a really strong progressive agenda. And he said it's not true that they haven't done anything remotely progressive. And what he does is he just points to the Democrats opposing Trump nominees as being progressive. Just like the easiest thing to do. I think Kamala Harris voted against every Trump nominee. Wow. They still all got through largely. And I don't know what progressive agenda Peter Beinart wants to put forward, but 2 weeks ago in The Atlantic, he published a call for Democrats to scapegoat Latino immigrants and to demand that they learn to speak English and assimilate more strongly. I don't know if he's ever, been in any immigrant community. I've lived in Los Angeles in immigrant communities for years, and I don't really see a resistance to learning to speak English. It's just that, the first generation sometimes struggles with that. But he's basically calling for scapegoating immigrants and moving right. Maybe moving closer to the position that Tucker Carlson takes on immigration. So I don't know what progressive agenda where he wants them to go.
Even further to the right, as always.
Then he takes on the issue of Russia's interference in the 2016 election. Now, first of all, we have to look at the language here. Interference.
Yeah, this is a very important point. Frequently, media outlets and politicians will use really ambiguous, vague language like Russia hacked the election.
What does it mean? Does it mean hacking, or does it mean RT broadcasting in America? Because when the director of national intelligence, James Clapper, put out his report supposedly containing the evidence of Russian interference, 8 out of the 23 pages in his report focused on RT and specifically on Breaking the Set, which was Abby Martin's show, which hasn't been on air for 2 years. So we don't really know what they mean by Russian interference. Call me crazy. I don't think RT swung the election in any way. And if you actually watched it, RT America was supporting Bernie pretty strongly. And it was not pumping up Donald Trump the same way that CNN was when they did hundreds of hours of positive coverage of Trump. I remember just flipping on CNN one day and seeing a special about Melania and that she's a businesswoman and, she's just so dynamic and she's a model and she's beautiful and glamorous. It was like a commercial or an infomercial for Melania Trump.
Or even when they didn't do openly positive coverage, they would broadcast entire rallies held by Trump.
Yeah.
So that's even worse than having positive coverage.
Like racist incitement rallies where he would just incite against immigrants and Muslims. I would be sitting in a hotel lobby and all of a sudden Trump would come on and everyone would gather around the bar to hear what he had to say about Mexicans in America. And it would just be broadcast without commercials, unexpurgated. I'd never seen anything like that. So I didn't see RT doing that.
As multimillionaire CBS CEO Les Moonves infamously put it, Trump's campaign might be bad for America, but it's damn good for CBS. Very profitable.
But really the issue for Beinart is the hacks. And he says that, when it comes to Russia's interference in the 2016 election, progressives like Blumenthal are behaving the way many conservatives behave on climate change. So he's likening me to a climate change denier because I've called into question whether Vladimir Putin actually gathered with his military intelligence services and his, the Federal Security Bureau and ordered them to hack to get Donald Trump elected, and whether the Trump campaign knew this was happening and were sort of colluding in order to get elected. I find this highly suspect, and I'll explain why. But first of all, James Clapper and John Brennan, the former CIA director, are not peer-reviewed scientists. Just because 4 intelligence agencies say they have high or moderate confidence that the hacking was directed by Russia's government and that it took place doesn't mean that this is science, that this is anything like climate change. I mean, this is one of the most absurd analogies I've ever seen, because it's Beinart and those like him in the liberal resistance who are accepting purely on faith the conclusions of the intelligence agencies without demanding any concrete evidence. And so we need to talk about the evidence. I mean, I talk about this as much as I can, but I only had 4 minutes on Tucker Carlson. Beinart has unlimited space, and the only evidence he can provide is, well, the intelligence agencies said this. That's why I referred on Tucker Carlson to a bootlicking press and a bootlicking liberal opposition, because we're believing whatever the CIA and James Clapper say. James Clapper, who lied under oath to Congress about domestic surveillance by the NSA, we're just accepting him on what he says on faith.
And of course, it's a cliche now, but it's important to bring up. These same intelligence agencies were the ones who peddled lies to justify the invasion of Iraq, willfully peddling blatant lies about supposed weapons of mass destruction.
I mean, that's an easy one. I mean, look at everything they've done since then. They've gotten everything wrong since then. I mean, what about Libya? Did they do any assessment of who the rebels were? And we'll talk about Syria. John Brennan wanted that operation so bad. And what has it led to? Massive expansion of Al-Qaeda. No strategic goals were achieved there. So they just tend to get things so wrong. Then there's the FBI. I don't know how any self-proclaimed liberal can trust the FBI at its word after its history.
Yeah, this is staggering to me. I mean, clearly, many liberals don't like socialists and the revolutionary left, but the FBI has a decades-long history that is well documented of not just arresting and surveilling and oppressing civil rights activists and revolutionary leftists. The FBI has been involved in numerous assassinations of Americans, most notably of Fred Hampton, the chairman of the Chicago Black Panther Party. But the FBI was also heavily surveilling and even blackmailing Martin Luther King Jr., sending him threats and telling him he needed to kill himself, calling him a disgusting, filthy animal. And we now know today, thanks to Freedom of Information Act requests, that the FBI is surveilling and monitoring Black Lives Matter activists, just as it did with the Occupy Wall Street movement.
But let's talk about the intelligence agencies. They didn't even make the attribution, or what's known as the intelligence community. Like they're these Mensa members who are wise men who go in the woods and consult the oracle and gain the truth. The attribution of the hack of the DNC was made by a private for-profit cybersecurity firm called CrowdStrike, and it made the attribution within 24 hours. It made the attribution in a single blog post that was accompanied by storytelling style graphics. CrowdStrike is headed by someone named Dmitry Alperovitch, who is known for excellent marketing techniques, excellent public relations techniques, but is not particularly known for getting it right when it comes to attributing hacks to foreign governments. Alperovitch and CrowdStrike invented two Russian hacking crews called Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, which are supposedly attached to APT 28 and 29, which are supposedly the FSB and the Russian GRU. So they basically made up these names so they could market the report. There's no other reason they did that. A few months after issuing this report, they issued another report claiming that Russia hacked into the app that's used to guide Ukrainian artillery in eastern Ukraine in the war against Russian separatists. This was totally false. It was retracted. The Ukrainian military itself said that this had not taken place. Voice of America even reported on this bungled report by CrowdStrike. But as a result of the publicity CrowdStrike has gotten around the DNC, it is now valued, as a direct result, it is now valued at $1 billion. The firm is doing incredibly well.
It's also important to point out that Dmitry Alperovitch is linked in some ways to key parts of the U.S. national security state. Especially, he's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council.
Yep.
For those who don't know, the Atlantic Council is essentially NATO's think tank.
Yep.
It is funded by NATO. The Atlantic Council gets money from the U.S. government, which it says openly on its website. It's also funded by a slew of U.S. allies, including the UAE, the UK, you go down the list, and thus, predictably, as one might expect, it never fails to provide moral and intellectual justification for every single Western regime change operation, every single military intervention. It never fails to provide some kind of intellectual flax who will go to bat for the U.S. State Department. The fact that Dmitry Alperovitch, the founder of CrowdStrike, is a senior fellow at this unofficial NATO think tank is very significant.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. Now, this raises this calls for actual peer review. I mean, this calls for doing the kind of science that scientists actually do around climate change that Beinart and those who think like him don't want to do on hacking. They just want to browbeat all the skeptics who actually want to look at the evidence. I called up Jeffrey Carr, and I'm going to publish, my interview with him and his comments in the coming days. Jeffrey Carr is a cybersecurity consultant. He's worked with companies that were facing hacking attempts. And one of the reasons that he's able to speak candidly, and he's one of the few people who can issue skepticism about these kind of shabby reports by groups like CrowdStrike, is because he's not looking for work anymore with these firms or with the companies that these firms are working with. So he doesn't have to play the game. And Jeffrey Carr said, and this is like almost a direct quote from him, when a for-profit company like CrowdStrike publishes a report, there should be a peer review by other companies. Forensics isn't black and white. Other companies would come up with different results, and we've seen that over time. You can continue your forensics until the customer says stop because of the cost. And so and that's what happened with the DNC. In every other profession, there's peer review. It's considered a professional requirement. Nobody can do the evidence. Nobody can approve or reject the reports. If you don't have to do peer review and defend your conclusion, who's going to voluntarily do it? And, there was no peer review around the DNC hacks. This is actually especially incredible when you consider that Jay Johnson, the former Department of Homeland Security director, James Comey, the former director of the FBI, admitted before Congress that they never examined the DNC server. And in fact, the DNC has rebuffed efforts by the FBI to do so. So only CrowdStrike has seen it. The intelligence agencies with their high or moderate confidence have not seen the DNC server. And very few journalists have gone to the DNC to ask why.
This is a key point that is almost never conceded by Russiagate fanatics. Again, this is incredibly important. The FBI never actually investigated the DNC servers.
Here's Jeffrey Carr. What Jeffrey Carr told me, the FBI should have had access to that server. It's ridiculous that they didn't. The DNC said no, and I don't know why. I don't understand that. I don't think any journalist has tried to get an answer to that, especially considering the uproar generated by that report. Nobody in the government saw that server. That's mind-blowing to me. This is Carr continuing to talk, and I'm kind of paraphrasing him. You can't just simply attribute malware to a foreign government, because if it gets implanted in someone's server, it can be then reverse engineered and used by whoever gained access to it. And it may contain some of the same characteristics of the original malware. For example, Cyrillic figures. So it requires human intelligence and signals intelligence. Human intelligence would be what the CIA does. Signals intelligence would be what the NSA does to determine that the malware matched an actual, what's commonly known as an active measure. You might have been able to surveil someone saying, yeah, let's do this. You might have some better intelligence than the dodgy dossier that was produced by, an opposition firm in Washington that, just no one can take seriously. As Carr said, you can't learn who's behind the keyboard, who's driving the car by just looking at the malware. You can only get a description of the vehicle, but you can't get anything about the driver. And this was really apparent 2 days before the election of Emmanuel Macron in France. 2 days before the election, of course, no one knew who was going to win. He was running against Marine Le Pen, who had gone to visit Vladimir Putin in Moscow, who was taking a Eurosceptic line, was, kind of being linked to Russia in the same way that Trump has been. And Macron's email was hacked. Immediately, a group called Trend Micro, another for-profit private cybersecurity firm, which is based in Japan, took CrowdStrike's report and extrapolated from it the claims in the report to blame this hack in France on Russia and the Russian government. And it was reported in headlines on the cover of the New York Times, on the front of the Washington Post, that Russia had done it. Then what happened? Macron wins. The French government cybersecurity agency examines the server, as our government cybersecurity agencies have refused to do or not done, and they found that, in fact, the Russian government hadn't done the hack. They couldn't determine who had, and that it could have been anyone. And this story was buried in the Associated Press. And that's probably why Peter Beinart made this massive factual error when he stated, what's more, officials in France and Germany say Russia has tried to subvert their elections too. That's just false. It's a total falsehood. The Atlantic should retract it, and I'll ask them to do so when I write about this.
This is an important point to underscore too. I mean, this story really was buried. If you Google it and you try to look through the news results, basically the only outlets that covered it were AP and some outlets that either reran the AP Newswire or rewrote it. There was no substantive investigation into the fact that numerous news outlets and politicians had lied for months, claiming that Russia was intervening in France's elections. And then when it's exposed that they were lying the entire time by the head of the French cybersecurity agency overseeing the investigation, you can hear a pin drop. That's real censorship.
Yeah, it's just part of the political culture in mainstream media now that you just have to feast on anything related to Russian collusion. And when your story falls apart, you kind of report it on page A14 or issue a clarification, but it's just, you can't acknowledge that there might be another side to the story. You cannot acknowledge any skepticism. And, so therefore, none of what we're talking about has been investigated, but I think it should be the subject of a major investigation because what happened in France actually discredits, in a lot of ways, CrowdStrike's entire case that the Russian government definitely hacked the DNC. I'm going to be agnostic about this. I could see why they would want to do that. I could see why they didn't want to have Hillary Clinton be president after she compared Vladimir Putin to Hitler, after what we did supporting a coup to topple a democratically elected government in Ukraine, after what Bill Clinton did in the 90s, through Boris Yeltsin to basically ravage Russia's economy. I can understand why they would want to do it, but I just don't see the evidence that it happened. And what happened in France really undermines CrowdStrike's report because CrowdStrike is relying on the exclusive use theory, that it was the same APTs, that CrowdStrike called Fancy Bear and Cozy Bear, the same government actors that hacked France. Then the French government comes out and says, no, it could have been anyone, which means necessarily that the APTs that CrowdStrike has identified as the hackers of the DNC could also be anyone. It totally discredits their attribution. It discredits their analysis. And therefore, it discredits everything Peter Beinart wrote in his piece about skeptics being climate change, the equivalent of climate change deniers. He is the one accepting what might be junk science on faith alone.
Here we're going to draw it out a bit to a wider perspective and look at the bigger picture as to what Russiagate means and what the effects will be in the future.
Now, why does this matter? Why do we have to have this argument about the granular details of the hacking? It's because of the long-term political repercussions, which could affect us for the rest of our lives in an extremely negative way. Well, I went on Tucker and I criticized Senator Ben Cardin for referring to this alleged Russian hacking as a political Pearl Harbor. The Washington Post also called it the crime of the century. I think 9/11 happened in this century, but
yeah, and this is particularly egregious considering the Washington Post helped justify the illegal U.S. invasion of Iraq, which destroyed the country based on U.S. government lies that the Washington Post not only willfully spread, but ultimately profited from.
And Beinart called Cardin's analogy apt. It's an apt analogy, according to Beinart. Why is it apt? What did we do after Pearl Harbor? We wound up entering World War II. So does Beinart think that we should initiate a world war? Should we respond militarily? Should we respond with sanctions? Is it smart to respond with sanctions? He claimed that skeptics like Glenn Greenwald and I have legitimate concerns about the proxy wars that are associated with the new Cold War, which we see in Ukraine and Syria and elsewhere, but that we just need to defend our democracy from hacks. How can you say that we have legitimate concerns, but that we need to act like this is a political Pearl Harbor? If we act like this is a political Pearl Harbor before examining the granular details of the evidence, then we will see not only proxy wars, but possibly hot wars and a direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed country that has the capacity to incinerate us. And I don't want to see that happen. You look at what's already happening as a result of the domestic partisan hysteria around supposed Russian interference. We talked about the sanctions at the top of the broadcast, which are completely opposed by the European Union. Everybody in the European Union, but particularly Germany, is completely opposed to this. And not only because it will lead to a dangerous counter-escalation by Russia, which actually restrained itself during the first round of sanctions in December. Putin refused to respond when 35 diplomats were ejected from the U.S. and consular facilities were closed in the Washington area. But they oppose it because it will have very negative economic consequences for trade. And so I thought that the liberal resistance was all about defending our EU allies and our NATO allies. But in this case, they really don't care. And then on July 31st, we saw the Pentagon introduce a plan to arm the Ukrainian military, which is fighting a war or a proxy war with Russian separatists. And you know, this war is already a disaster. It's led to the displacement of 500,000 people. The Ukrainian military is working hand in glove with militias like the Azov Battalion and the Aidar Battalion, who are neo-Nazi militias inspired by the Nazi SS.
And to underscore this fact, the Azov Regiment is actually a part of the National Guard of Ukraine, and they use SS symbols.
Yeah, I mean, they glorify Nazi collaborators like Stepan Bandera. And what you essentially have in Kiev is kind of a coalition of neo-Nazis and oligarchs. And what the Pentagon wants to do is intensify that conflict, which is really the most, I think one of the greatest provocations you can make to Russia. It was opposed not only by the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign removed that language calling to arm the Ukrainian military or send more weapons to the Ukrainian military in the Republican National Convention's platform. And he was accused of Russian collusion for doing that. But it was also opposed by Barack Obama. The candidate who supported it was Hillary Clinton. And so you've actually seen the Russia hysteria in Washington establish so much pressure on Trump that he has actually adopted Hillary Clinton's position, a position that he resisted and his campaign resisted during the convention. We're heading into the abyss, and it's all because of this absurd campaign by the Democratic establishment that's myopic, it's cynical, designed to paper over its failures, and we're paying for the radical tendencies of a military intelligence apparatus that's stimulating Trump's opposition with constant leaks, always or often related to his diplomacy with Russia. You never see leaks when he's dealing with Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, any of these other countries.
And again, just to stress how obscene this is, Trump is drastically escalating the war in Yemen. He's drastically escalating aggression against Iran and North Korea. He's pushing for several new wars. He's ramping up drone strikes. He's doing all of this, and he's trying to sell $110 billion in arms to Saudi Arabia. He's trying to arm the most extreme, absolute monarchy on the planet. And instead of actually leaking sensitive information about any of these really horrible policies Trump is pursuing, not even just on those issues, but domestically, where he's giving ICE free rein to terrorize immigrants, where, again, he's dismantling the Environmental Protection Agency and essentially giving the Koch brothers and, the oligarchical groups that they control free rein to destroy the planet for corporate profit. Instead of leaks about all of these very important critical issues, these issues are sidelined by the media, and all we hear about nonstop is Russia, Russia, Russia.
Yeah, and I think one reason for that is that Russia actually has so little influence in Washington. I mean, both parties are heavily involved in many ways with Israel and Saudi Arabia. Half of Washington works for the Gulf states or with the pro-Israel lobby. I mean, just look at who's funding the think tanks along K Street and Mass Ave. It's sort of like Russia has so little influence that it's convenient to talk about Russian collusion because no one has any direct ties to Russia, or so few people do. And when you really look at Trump's ties, there are ties to Russia. It's, he's lost his investors in New York because he's a slime bag, and he sought them elsewhere, either through the UAE and Saudi sovereign wealth fund, or through commercial ties to Russian oligarchs, wherever he can find them. I think it's legitimate to go after him for that, but instead we're talking about this conspiratorial grand narrative of collusion. Well, let's just talk about one leak that I think could provide a bridge into the next subject. It was the leak of the back channel of Jared Kushner to Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador to the U.S. It's really upset a lot of people. There's a back channel to the ambassador. It must mean they're talking about, how Russia can take over America. A lot of people who don't understand diplomacy or foreign policy, which is like most of the idlibs, the Saturday Night Live pussy hat liberals do not understand that, Henry Kissinger had back channels to China, and it was very important to achieve certain things. This is kind of the way you do business. Israel has back channels to Hezbollah to resolve border issues.
And the Obama administration had back channels to Russia too, especially when it came to the policy in Syria. So you don't shoot each other's planes down.
Or the Iran deal. That was all done through back channels. Kushner, I don't think, has any qualification to handle foreign policy beyond having married Ivanka Trump and maybe having, I don't know, he's about as qualified as any bar mitzvah boy whose family has donated massive amounts of money to Israel. That's really his qualification. Let's just get that off the table. But nevertheless, he's been selected to handle this issue. And the issue is Syria, de-escalating Syria and establishing coordination with Russia against ISIS. That's what the back channel was about. And he couldn't do it. The reason he couldn't do it was because the national security state, the military intelligence apparatus, particularly elements in the Pentagon and the National Security Council, have sabotaged attempts to coordinate with Russia and de-escalate Syria. For example, what we saw in September after John Kerry, with Obama's blessing, negotiated security coordination in Syria with Russia to go after ISIS, joint operations room with Russia. And what happened? In the city of Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria, the Pentagon authorized a bombing that struck the Syrian army, which was holding back an ISIS onslaught against the city. Some 80 soldiers were killed. ISIS captured a strategic hilltop, took the airport, and it appears very clear, and especially if you read Gareth Porter's report on this incident, and we're going to bring Gareth Porter on later, that this was a deliberate attempt to sabotage the ceasefire and sabotage Russian coordination, overseen by then Defense Secretary Ash Carter. So you have these legitimate fears. That's why you need a back channel. And this leak about Kushner's back channel to Kislyak created the impression of collusion, and it helped sabotage the détente which was needed with Russia, the diplomacy that was needed with Russia to end a bloody 5 or 6 year civil war, proxy war, whatever you want to call it, that's cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Trump has finally done what needed to be done. He finally ended the covert CIA program to arm anti-Assad rebels in Syria. These were rebels who were being substantially led by Jabhat al-Nusra, the Syrian affiliate of Al-Qaeda, Syrian franchise of Al-Qaeda. It was just such a no-brainer. It's probably the only good thing Trump's done and might be the only good thing he'll ever do. And here's how the Washington Post framed it. This is the Washington Post headline announcing it. Trump ends covert CIA program to arm anti-Assad rebels in Syria, a move sought by Moscow. So, what they do is they implant in the minds of the idlibs that Russia is hacking our foreign policy, and that, otherwise it would have been great to arm these rebels if we just weren't controlled by Russia, communist Russia.
And you have pundits like Joy and Reid who repeatedly refer to Russia as the Soviet Union and as communist, even though it has had a plutocratic capitalist government since 1991, thanks to policies pursued by the U.S. But on this point, it's also important to stress that that Washington Post article that framed the end to the CIA program as a supposed Kremlin plot was by no means alone. And I published an article for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, the media watchdog, in which I looked into other media outlets that made the same accusations. So it wasn't just the Washington Post, also The Guardian, USA Today, the Telegraph. There were numerous newspapers, and the hilarious thing, especially in regard to Syria, which again we'll be talking about in the next episode, is that the Washington Post article that framed this all as a supposed master plan by the evil Russian puppet master, this article actually quoted Charles Lister. Charles Lister is one of the most notoriously hawkish analysts who pervades the U.S. media. He works for Gulf-funded think tanks, and he never fails to toe the line. I mean, he's always pushing for more military aggression.
Yeah, He's basically the Mid-Atlantic spokesman for the Syrian rebels. I mean, he's the one who's clamoring for weapons.
And in this article in the Washington Post piece that he's cited in, he says, quote, "We are falling into a Russian trap."
Yeah.
And this really says everything about the way things are framed. You have someone whose background is not given. So this is a contextless quote. He's just a talking head who's supposedly this expert, who's not an expert on Russia in any way. He's barely even an expert on Syria, but he doesn't claim to be an expert on Russia. And he's quoted in this Washington Post story as if he's some neutral observer. What's not mentioned is that this guy has, for years, openly called for the U.S. to violently topple the government in Syria. And, of course, Syria is a close Russian ally.
I mean, more than that, he is one of the key figures advising, he advised the Cameron government in the UK and other governments to arm the rebels. And he claimed, he most recently bragged at a Middle East Institute gathering last week that he has regular contact with members of Al-Qaeda in Syria. That would be legitimate maybe if you're just some journalist, but, this is a guy who's lobbying for them to have more weapons. And I wonder what will happen with his career now that the weapons are being cut off. I wonder if we'll see him on a beach someday with a metal detector. Probably not, because if you look at, Peter Beinart's career, someone who consistently gets everything wrong, he just keeps getting kicked upstairs. This is the anti-meritocracy in Washington that just rewards failure.
Well, and I mentioned Jamie Kirchik, who's another incredibly hawkish.
I don't know if he needs to be mentioned ever again, but you can go on with that.
Well, Jamie Kirchik was also just hired by the Brookings Institution, which is ostensibly a moderate. Some people even refer to it as a liberal think tank. And this is one of the most notorious right-wing war hawks who now was promoted from his previous neocon think tank to one of the most prestigious think tanks in the world.
He's also just really boring to read. And I mean, who reads him or hears what he just writes these slanderous 20,000 word screeds that nobody reads. So how did he get that position? The Foreign Policy Initiative, which was, the Project for a New American Century 2.0, folded partly because, the Idlibs have accepted the neocons into their ranks against Trump. And that's who Jamie Kirchik was. Paul Singer, who's one of the big pro-Israel donors, one of the biggest pro-Israel donors in the country, was funding the Foreign Policy Initiative. And he probably just took his money to the Brookings Institute and said, hey, can you, give this failed middling neocon fanatic another sinecure where he can write slanderous 20,000 word screeds? I will give you $150,000 so he can maintain his elite lifestyle in Washington and, have drinks at, Eli Lake's house with Rosie Gray. And that's really the story of the think tanks in Washington. It's a scandal. It's a huge scandal. It's pay for play, whether it's Paul Singer, the UAE, Qatar. And that's sort of how the sausage has been made on Syria and our Syria policy. That's how people like Charles Lister got in there. We're not going to see Charles Lister, shaving off donor kebab, but he's part of the anti-meritocracy. We're going to talk about that. Oh, I just want to make a brief kind of correction. I said that, Trump hadn't done anything good other than ending these, the CIA program to arm and equip the rebels. But I should also add that his election triggered the resignation of Victoria Nuland from the State Department. So that's also good. But now let's talk about, what was the CIA program to arm the rebels and what was so wrong with it?
Yeah, in the next episode, we'll be discussing the history of the CIA program, which is known as Operation Timber Sycamore. We'll talk about many of the media myths around it, and we'll talk about just how disastrous it was. And we'll quote mainstream media reports, establishment think tanks that have all acknowledged how what we've been living through in the past few years is really going to come back to haunt, of course, not just Syrians who have suffered the most, but much of the world for years, if not decades to come, and how Al-Qaeda and ISIS have been the real victors of the war in Syria, even though ISIS, in its formal manifestation appears to be on its last legs, fortunately. Unfortunately, ISIS is certainly not going to be defeated as a political movement for some time to come, it looks like. And we'll be discussing just how the CIA program fueled all of these extremist groups that ironically were used to justify waging the war on terror for these past 16 years.
All right, so let's have some frantic NPR jazz.
Thanks so much for listening to the first episode of Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton here with Max Blumenthal, and be sure to check out our future episodes. We will be releasing 2 more in the next few days, and then after that we will have a weekly program, and you can find us at ModerateRebelsRussiagateDelusion and also on Twitter at ModerateRadio and on Facebook. Have a good night, or morning, or afternoon, or whatever time of day it is for you.